So welcome everyone to our webinar. It's great to see all of you here with us to discuss a very important and interesting issue. My name is Kati. I work with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, or short UAEM, where I am with our European Empowerment Committee. And today I'm very grateful that we have two very knowledgeable and experienced speakers with us. Dr. Gita Sen and Chee Yoke Ling will get into the topic access to medicines, why should feminists care? And the webinar will be moderated by Mariam Mubarak-Gabriel, who's also working with UAEM. And before we get started with that, I would just like to give you a short overview about our organizations and this webinar series. So this webinar series is set up by the two organizations UAEM and Feminist. UAEM stands for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. It's a global student-led volunteer organization that aims to make access to essential medicines more affordable and equitable for everyone. Universities play an important role in achieving this goal, since many technologies are developed in our labs with public funds. And that's why we as students work directly at our universities and influence how their technologies are licensed so that these technologies are accessible in people. And one of our slogans puts that really well: our drugs, our labs, our responsibility. And the other organization is Feminist. Feminist stands for Feministische Medizin, or in English, Feminist Medicine. And they are a German-speaking association of doctors and medical students who advocate for gender equality within medicine and the healthcare system. And they see themselves as political actors, providers of impulses, and an empowering network. And their feminism is intersectional, and we see its clear necessity everywhere in the medical context, in health policy, in clinical everyday life, and research, as well as in teaching. And we from UAEM and Feminist have set up the webinar series called Gender and Health, exploring the connection of both these topics, and also for us to do better as future healthcare and public health professionals by making medicine more representative. Of course, there's a lot to talk about for this big title, and we decided to set up 4 webinar sessions with very different focuses. Our past three sessions covered the topics equality, diversity, and inclusion challenges in healthcare, as well as trans and gender diversity in healthcare, and non-binary introduction, language, and wording in patient contact. And then today, we have our 4th and last session, and for a more detailed description of what we get into today, and also to introduce our speakers in more detail, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Mariam, who is a member of the European Coordinating Committee of UAEM and has recently had the opportunity to represent UAEM at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So over to you, Mariam.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Kathy, and for helping organize this extremely insightful webinar series together with Lydia and the Femna team. I think you all did a great job. And I think I speak for most people who have been following the series when I say that we learned a lot. Our topic today is an intersection between the work of UAEM and Feminist. It is access to medicine from a feminist perspective. We will be discussing the topic with 2 very experienced speakers, and we want to keep it lively and informal. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we will address them as soon as possible. Our 2 speakers work with the campaign Feminists for a People's Vaccine, or FPV for short, for equitable, accessible, and affordable COVID-19 vaccines, drugs, therapeutics, and equipment. The campaign is set up by the 2 organizations, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, or DAWN, and Third World Network, or TWN. It is a very important movement that many allies have been working on for the past years. And on this slide, you can see all the partners that are involved in the campaign. To introduce our speakers, our first speaker is Dr. Gita Sen, a feminist economist who has combined a long career as an academic with activism and advocacy in support of economic, social, ecological, and gender justice. She is a founding member and currently general co-coordinator of DAWN, a Southern feminist network committed to justice and human rights. DAWN, together with TWN, function as the hub for Feminists for People's Vaccines, or FPV. Also working with the FPV campaign is our second speaker, Chee Yoke Ling, a lawyer by training and the executive director of Third World Network, an international policy, research, and advocacy organization based in Malaysia, which focuses on sustainable development issues and international relations. Among her focus areas is public health, in particular access to affordable treatments through the national implementation of flexibilities in the agreement on trade-related aspects on intellectual property rights administered by the World Trade Organization. And I would like to thank you both for being here with us today to share your expertise on the topic. To start off the discussion, I would like to refer back to your work for the Feminists for a People's Vaccine campaign, because I think when most people mention access to medicines and feminism, they don't directly see a correlation between the two movements. So I was wondering, Yoke Ling, could you maybe tell us more about what has been the broad landscape of advocacy for access to medicines? And why has it been so hard to get feminists to engage in the past?
Right. Thank you so much, Mariam. Once again to UAEM for pulling this together, inviting myself and Gita. And to all of you, good day, good evening, good morning from your different parts of the world. For me, it's a pleasure to be here because I also interact, I think, with some of your colleagues in the Antibiotic Resistance Coalition, where UAEM is also a very active partner. So it's really good to see that when you started, it was bringing medical students together, and now you've got law students and students from other disciplines, and I think, and you're also moving to many parts of the South. So that's a really important part of the movement, and we're very excited to be working with you. I will deal with the first part of the question, which is really what is a broad landscape of advocacy for access to treatment, of which the medicines are a very key component. I think all of us at the global level, who didn't really think about this in too much in terms of some of the structural barriers to access in an ordinary person, I think has been really shaken up with COVID-19, which we will also come to. But really the battle, I think, started in terms of a global campaign and advocacy, really with HIV/AIDS. Gita herself has also been very much involved in this, so she will tell her story on this broad landscape. But for many of us, I think it was really when, there are many diseases throughout the generations where there's just been no cure, or even just to be able to deal with infectious diseases, chronic diseases, so that we can have better quality of life. So when the whole explosion of HIV took place in the 70s and the 80s, there really was a sense of, my God, there is no hope. I think for all of you in this generation, this is something you read about, but I think really in the sort of modern times, it was to have a virus that could actually just wreak such devastation everywhere in the world, even in the United States, the richest country in the world. So when there was this possibility of treatment that could actually arrest HIV and bring people who are affected, to have productive life and to have quality of life, it was a miracle. But it was inaccessible because it's very expensive. And I think one of the things that really struck us all when we were sort of radicalized into the access to medicines work with HIV, it really was the rallying call, was that it wasn't a new blockbuster miracle drug. It was really an existing molecule. It was really research that had been done before it existed. And it was a discovery. It was a discovery whereby it could actually impact on HIV infections. But yet, because it was developed as a commercial product by one company, and locked up in a monopoly for at least 20 years, you just couldn't get access to it. It was so expensive. So I think that really was the rallying call for the global movement around that, and the African movements, especially the HIV community. They were the ones who led the voice, and I think this is an important point to remember as we move into what we're going to discuss in more detail today. It is really the voice of the impacted and the organizing of those who are impacted and all the different parts of society around there. So I would say the South African, HIV movement really galvanized, shook up the world to say the deep inequity when something is available to treat and it's unavailable because it's too expensive, it's monopolized. And Medicine Sans Frontier came in, and many of us who got into the access really was because of HIV. And we took on companies, 40 biggest companies in the world in the pharmaceutical, the big pharma, actually threatened to take the South African government to court because they were actually, and it was really not in intellectual property, it was in do with competition law. Just really something that a government should really do as a matter of logic and need, and because it's the right of people to health, nothing that is so illegal. And yet you had the full force of pharma. And I think that really was the lightning rod. And that was, I would say, the birth of the global movement on access. So to fast forward, I think it made such a difference because there was existing capacity in Brazil to make generics and in India. So it wasn't that we didn't have. So very, very familiar story when we look at COVID-19 in the last 2 years, right? You had the manufacturing capacity, you had the raw materials, but you were not allowed to do it because of this barrier called intellectual property. So but once that was, so we worked on it, and of course we had this intellectual property agreement in WTO. That was a big problem, but it wasn't completely. Back then in the early 90s when it was concluded, we all said this is the end of the world, the freedom to operate, there's no more choice in terms of what kind of intellectual property system you're going to have. But even then, there were still a lot of fight from many of the negotiators, especially from the South, who managed to keep enough of the fundamental freedom for us to operate. And this flexibility is what we call flexibility, is like, being able to do certain things without the consent of the patent holder, etc., is in there. But our governments were not aware of how to use that, because pharma and all the technical support of how to make your laws in our countries were telling us to really interpret it in the most narrow way. So we had a number of years, and the Access campaign really was about, one, awareness. Secondly, how do you make those laws in your country comply with your international obligations, but at the same time meet public health needs and the right to health. So I think that work of intellectual rigor, organizing North, South, East, West, from the ones who are, from people who are directly affected, to the medical community, to the legal rights community, to just getting everybody together. And I think we actually made that happen. We forced countries to realize that they can do many things. We forced generics to be able to be, produced, and it brought down treatment amazingly once you allowed that to happen. And it happened again with hepatitis C. So it is an ongoing thing that, and we will have lessons to learn about what happened and did not happen in the last 2 years. So that's the broad landscape. And I think that coming together was absolutely crucial at all levels. So I'll stop there. And then, Gita can tell us why the feminist movement was not part of that at that point. Thank you.
Yes, and that was one of the most biggest frustrations of my life at that time, because I, as a feminist economist, very concerned about the political economy of production, consumption, monopolies, and how they work, knew that this was a huge issue. But I couldn't even get my, compañeras within Dawn, my own organization, to fully commit to really that this was worth doing, this was something to work on. I think there's probably multiple reasons why that was the case at that time. And I'm not saying that nobody was there. Yes, some of us were there, but it wasn't like it wasn't seen as a feminist issue among the broader feminist community. Some of it, I think, had to do with the fact that that it seemed to be, for a lot of feminists, something to do with lawyers. And many were not lawyers. So it seemed very technical, what seemed to be going on. And then anytime access to medicines discussions came up, the technical people, if they were not lawyers, were people who would come out with these long biochemical names which ended in NABs and whatever. And, you know, they would lose the audience very quickly as a result. That, of course, slightly facetious, but I think that in terms of, you know, in terms of an interest in getting engaged required an effort. But I think more important than that was the fact that at that time, where at the height of the struggle for antiretrovirals in the 90s, HIV wasn't seen really so much as a feminist or a women's issue. It was still seen as heavily a problem of key populations in the way that they were traditionally defined. And yes, there was an issue that had to do with the fact that women were far more vulnerable if they got infected to HIV, but was still seen as an issue of a subset of the community, not of everybody. I think that probably played something of a role, and it's taken quite a while to break away from that. And I think with COVID-19, as we'll see in our discussion, that really has broken that sort of barrier has broken quite significantly. I think also a third thing that has happened that's very important in terms of sort of jumping from where we were then to where we are now is that, and I'll speak now just from Dawn's perspective, we've always been very concerned about the political economy of globalization. That's been a big issue for us right from the beginning. But a real focus on corporations and corporate power in our work has been more recent. And therefore, understanding the extent to which everywhere you turn, the power of large corporations, whether it is COVID-19, whether it is medicines and pharma, whether it is food and sugar, whether it is breast milk and baby foods, whether it is agriculture and food more broadly, whether it is the digital industry. Now we see, you know, it's like the power of large corporations is much, much, much better, more strongly recognized among feminist movements. And there are many, many organizations that are concerned with and working on that. That wasn't the case at the time of the height of the antiretroviral struggle in HIV. And I think that has changed hugely now. So that's sort of a, you know, top of my head reasons for why it was like that now and the ways in which it's changed.
Yes, thank you, Gita. You both raised some very interesting topics. As you said, the access to medicines fight is definitely not new. We have seen all of it before, especially with the HIV crisis. And in the past, like you mentioned, it struggled to appeal to a broader audience, also specifically to feminists, for example. But we we saw quite a few of our campaigns really take off during the COVID pandemic. And I was wondering, do you feel like that has changed the access to medicines landscape? And if yes, how and why did that happen?
Maybe if I can just have a quick go at it first. I think, listening to what Gita was saying, why when women, and you talk about transmission of HIV, transmission from mother to child is a very big part of the prevention program of dealing with HIV. So women are actually, at the heart of the HIV program. And yet, the voice of the women were not really heard. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with really the stigmatization of those who are living with HIV. So it's a stigma as a whole for and then the way the UN, as Gita very, very correctly pointed out, frame it as key population. So you're out there, you are segmented. So because of the stigmatization, you then have this problem where the voice of women who are not allowed to be surfacing anyway in most cases are even much more suppressed. So that would perhaps be one of the difference in terms of what happened with COVID, because COVID-19 didn't recognize any variation. You got infected, rich, poor, whatever. And it was really pandemic. Therefore, it's a public health crisis. Everyone is affected. So there was and also the concentration of corporations really became much, much more integrated in the last 30 years, both in terms of the horizontal, integration and across vertical. We were just, remarking in a couple of different conversations that the fact that the tobacco industry pumped in so much money to try to defeat the waiver in the COVID-19 debate. It's like some people were saying, my God, when we first saw the news reports, why is the tobacco industry coming in to help to work with pharma? And then you look into the fact that they are also having a lot of direct interest, of course, in the pharmaceutical production. And they, of course, have a lot of intellectual property monopolies that they want to safeguard, right? And then you have, for example, Google. Google is actually now, has ventured into manufacturing of pharmaceutical products. So this massive concentration of corporations have really brought the role of corporations very much in the forefront. So for women and for all groups working on corporate capture, the kind of statements and arrogance of the Pfizer CEO, or the way they, all those clinical trials, the way they hijack a lot of public research. The vaccines really, I think that was the thing that really was a difference. So much of the first 3 or 4 vaccines were all really essentially public taxpayers research-based products, right? Many years. mRNA is not new, but you look at what happened with the clinical trials, right? And people were volunteering all over the world to do these clinical trials, governments and hospitals. So it was a whole network of really public good coming to work together. But then the product and everything else was so privatized. And where did Moderna and Pfizer run to with all the initial findings? We've never in medical history, in product development for pharmaceuticals and vaccines, seen information hit the headlines, because these companies were just issuing press releases to Wall Street, because they were more interested to say, oh my God, here's a new vaccine, with the fastest, we have ever had in history to develop a vaccine and bring it into the market. And the shares went up. They made so much money without selling a single dose, even before the results were out. No peer review. I mean, even with fast track, it raised many questions about safety and efficacy, right? They went there first. They didn't go to the drug regulatory authorities first. So I think that is very different. And so we were reading so much of it in social media, which we didn't have before in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. So that explosion of information, the arrogance of the industry, the fact that there is no stigma because everybody is really scared. We didn't know what this virus was about. I think that would, for me, really, open up the opportunity to have those prices come out. And then, of course, Gita had this brilliant idea to say, this is the moment, where are the voices of the feminists? So I will hand over to Gita, because she came to me. We have been talking for years. We've been working, and we both, all the organizations really look at political economy and structural barriers to equality and equity and rights. north-south and also within, and of course, for the feminist movement is another more and more layers of that. And we've been talking about doing more work together over the years. We kind of intersected, but really, I think when you called me last year, sometime in maybe February or January of 2021.
21, yeah.
21,
yeah.
It's not so long ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, over to you, Gita.
All right. So I have to say, I couldn't think because just when we thought the time was right to do this, we had to think, who was it that would actually be a strong partner to hold this, who would have the technical capacity, because we knew that the WTO would have to be dealt with. And we didn't even hesitate. I said, TWN, that's where we're going to try and see if we can actually make this function. But I want to step back a little bit again to that question of what changed this time around. And I think what Yoke Ling said about stigma and the fact that here was a pandemic that was affecting everybody. Yes, it originated in China, but it was very quickly in Europe. Mostly all of the early stuff was Europe, was Italy, was Greece, and then into the US and the UK. So it was clear that it was not a disease of the poor. It was not a disease that was picking up people because of their sexual preferences or practices or anything that could get easily stigmatized. At the same time, because it was a pandemic, it was very clear that it was hitting everybody, not only those who were directly affected and got infected by COVID-19, but also everyone else. So we saw sharp reductions as a result of the diversion of health services to deal with the pandemic in all kinds of programs, including very basic things like programs for antenatal care, programs for safe delivery and neonatal and infant care, newer services like services to address gender-based violence. So we started seeing a diversion of whatever little health resources was available in that direction. And that started hitting people directly where they lived. Secondly, yes, it was not that the COVID infected were stigmatized as such, although there was a little bit of stigma, but areas where there already was stigma, for instance, around adolescent sexuality, around the availability of safe abortion, very importantly around sex work, and so on. Those started, in fact, those people started feeling the pressure of the absence of services. So the first services that would disappear when there was a shortage of resources were those and the availability of those. The other big thing, of course, was the fact that so many frontline health workers, 80% are women. Varies depending on the country, but by and large, 70 to 80% of frontline health workers are women. And the differences and the hierarchies within the medical profession started becoming very clear as well. So everybody, all frontline health workers, from doctors to community level workers, were supposed to get immunized early, were supposed to have better access to PPE equipment to and treatment and so on. But of course, in very hierarchical societies, that's not the way it worked. If you were a doctor, you got a different kind of treatment than if you were a community level health worker who was expected to be working in the community, or you were at the front line when patients started coming in. We, in our website, the Fem4 People's Vaccine website, we have a bunch of podcasts that you might, some of you might find really interesting. In fact, I have to tell you that I was delighted that both Mariam and Kathy said that, Yoke Ling, you'll love this. They said they've been binge listening to our podcasts. So that's been great. But one of the fantastic podcasts that's there is of a person with disability, speaking about the kinds of challenges that people with disabilities faced, either whether to get vaccinated or certainly if they've got infected. Nothing, I mean, it's a very different world, as you know, depending on services and access for people living with disabilities, if you're in Europe or North America versus if you are in a lower middle income country. You don't have access. And that has been such a huge challenge for people with disabilities, and for women with disabilities, even more so. Informal workers, migrant workers, such a strong presence of women in those groups meant, in fact, that the recognition that this pandemic was something that feminists really needed to have a say in. And in Dawn, we've been doing this both from the perspective of access to medicines and this campaign, but also from a broader perspective of looking at how policies have been changed or not, government policies, national policies, how have they been affected by the pandemic, and what would be a feminist take on those. So we have a whole project on policy transformations as a result of the pandemic that is sort of a parallel project to the FPB campaign that we have going here.
Thank you, Gita and Yoke Ling. I think it is incredible, and I mean that in a bad way, how deep health inequities run, and how, yeah, even during such a huge medical crisis, they're still present, and we can't seem to go past that. So I think the work they have been doing with Feminists for People's Vaccine is very important to bring this to the forefront and to the attention of the public. And I was wondering if you could go a bit more in depth on the work and how feminists engaged in this campaign. You already mentioned the podcast, but is there more?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things about that before I get to that. You know, one of the very striking things, which is why it sort of became a natural for people, is that COVID-19, remember at the beginning when they kept telling you that the biology meant that because of the ACE2 receptors, older men with comorbidities were going to be the most at risk? Remember that? We don't hear much about that in these days. So how did a virus that was supposed to, in fact, infect older men with comorbidities much more than anybody else end up becoming much more widely spread than it is? And if you look at the if you look at death rates among young African American men in the US, much higher, much higher than among young white men. So what is going on? If you look at the hidden pandemic of violence against women, when you have the pandemic-based lockdowns, suddenly there was an explosion of violence against women and girls in the home as a result of women getting locked in with their abusers because of the pandemic. If you look at the insufficient access to wash, clean water, sanitation, good, decent quality housing, so that you're not living in a shack on top of a drain. All of those challenges meant that poorer communities and women who are responsible for subsistence and survival and taking care of people, taking care of patients, not all patients could end up in hospitals because the hospitals were overwhelmed. And of course, when that happens, you know that those who have power, those who have connections, those who have money, those who have clout are somehow able to get access. Although in this pandemic, even they couldn't get it. But for the poor, it meant don't even bother, stay at home. And what would that mean? Who took care of them at home? It was women. So we ended up with a pandemic which biologically should have infected older men, becoming a pandemic that affected poorer people, younger people, women in large numbers, high exposures because of the poor quality of and inadequacy of health services, because of the poor quality of housing and habitation, because of the fact that work and employment is so inadequate. People just had to work regardless. Even if there was a pandemic on, they had to put food on the table. So that meant being out there, even with everything being the risk of infection being as high as it was. So I think those kinds of systemic structural challenges, but also the systemic problem of racism and sexism and ableism and all of those, casteism have come together in this pandemic. So coming to your question, we felt we had to address these issues. We had to speak about the people who were not being spoken about. And what's more, we would have to get them to give them the space to voice their concerns, to voice their needs. So our podcasts do this with people with disability, with sex workers, with young people coming in to talk about what the pandemic has meant for them. How is it that they have been migrant workers? How is it that they have dealt with it? So among the things that we've done is really to put together this partnership of groups from across the world, mostly Southern, because we wanted really to give voice and space to subgroups in the South, but also Northern groups, groups that, including like UAEM. UAEM, of course, is there in both the North and the South now, wonderfully. But we have other groups which are primarily based in the North that are also very much, but who we feel very connected to in terms of their concerns and the work that they do. So we've produced issue papers, we've got podcasts. We've been doing, as part of the campaign, been trying to reach out regionally to groups to help them to mobilize in Africa, in the Pacific, and so on. And so let me hand over to Yoke Ling, who can talk about the other very important part of what the FPV campaign has been doing, which has to do with hard advocacy at the WTO. So over to you, Yoke Ling.
Yeah, I think even though we have couched the banner of this campaign as the Feminists for People's Vaccine, it is beyond a vaccine, as you can see from the scope. And really it is about, as Gita puts so clearly, the structural injustices and going back to fundamentals, nothing new. We know the social determinants of health has been there since how many decades? I mean, 3 generations. I mean, we look at how fast generations go these days, 2-3 generations. But we kind of level that. So what the pandemic did this time was really to just expose everything. How much countries that had moved to privatize health systems, that didn't invest enough in primary health care or in housing sanitation. So everything that was done wrong in terms of development and the basic rights, we're talking about, it really, it then created this high risk situation in a systemic way, right? So for us, from the beginning, it was really not just about the vaccine, but because the vaccine was really the race for the vaccine was the one that captured, attention for policymakers and politicians and the WHO. But we felt, given the history of the work on access to medicines and treatments, getting access to affordable products is only part of the whole picture. We have been very, very clear about that, as Gita has, stressed again and again, for both our organizations. If we don't tackle the fundamentals of the economy and the structural, barriers and remove them and put more firm structures in place, then you are just doing very cosmetic work. So to do this means you have to go where the rules are being made. Who decides what is legal or not legal? Who decides that intellectual property of monopolies is called rights? And then for human rights, we have to fight so hard, generation after generation, to even have the word right recognized, and then to make sure that the right, when it's actually recognized in a document, is then translated into reality at the local level, at the family level. And yet, with the stroke of a pen, intellectual property rights became a legal term in the WTO. Well, WTO was set up after all those agreements came out. This whole package of agreements, through this negotiation round called the Uruguay round, because it was launched in Uruguay. And it was all in the name of free trade. It was all in the name of, freedom of movement of people and services and goods, et cetera, And then, in the middle of this set of already complicated negotiations in the 80s, suddenly you had this thing called intellectual property. Now, how can you have something that is about creating monopolies, trademark, copyright, patents, in a way that we didn't have before as an international standard? Because before that, you have treaties over, since the Industrial Revolution, on industrial design, on copyright, but they're all different treaties. They're all pieces of different things. And a country can choose, a society and the peoples can choose whether, do I want to sign on to this treaty? Does my society have a value that wants to give legal recognition to monopolies on medicines, on food, on plants, on microorganisms? You have that choice when you don't have to join that system. And if you decide to join, you can pick and choose, right? Even now you give patents to an invention, it has to be maybe something that's technical and something mechanical. But the idea of, let's say, medicines and molecular bits and pieces and genetic sequences being owned was not something that was the norm. And I think I want to really stress this, and this is part of the campaign that we've been doing from day one on access, which was really galvanized through this campaign for Feminists for People's Vaccine, is that there is no such thing as intellectual property rights from the point of view of rights, really, truly, okay? So it is a legal construct. So how do we debunk that? Because so many of our politicians and policymakers are so kind of brainwashed systematically, right? To think that, if you have a lot of intellectual property rights, laws in your country, you recognize all these private rights, then investments will come to your country, you will get lots of innovation. And you are coming from public universities, even private universities. I love the logo about, our labs, right? And our responsibility. and really education, everything, every product in the medical world comes from taxpayers' investment. Whether it's through it's not just university, from the time each of us enters school, it's a public system. It's been like that for a long time. Even privatized systems have a lot of subsidies. So these are public goods. So this one stroke of signing this intellectual property agreement called TRIPS in 1992 really just changed everything. And we wanted to sort of debunk that. We said, look, the world did not, it started with that, but it's not that it's been there forever. The system of innovation was a much more collaborative one. People were sharing across universities. Of course, there was competition. You want to get published, etc., but you didn't lock up. Today, some of the best books, none of us can afford to buy, right? Because it's copyrighted. It is so limited in how you can even produce. When I went to university in the law school in Malaysia, we could just take a very expensive law book, and we could go to the photocopy shop in the university, and we could actually photocopy the whole book, because our laws allowed us to do that. There was no restriction. Today, you can't do that. That's infringement of copyright. So you can't get access. You go to libraries. So librarians, for example, associations are one of the strongest voices, not heard globally, but they fight because they, as library operators and managers, know, and universities, Gita, right, like yours, they, even when they buy the books, students can't photocopy. Or you have digital, and then they monitor you through technological, tracing in your computers, whether you are downloading things. So, access to knowledge, so all these are tied. So when COVID came, it wasn't just patents over vaccines, it was patents and industrial design claims over ventilator, mask, the 3M mask, the famous mask, why was there a shortage? Is it so difficult to make? No, it was because, and we tracked it down through one of the groups in the US, they just did US Patent Office search, that 3M mask actually had more than 200 patents around it. And you will ask yourself, what on earth is there in that mask that actually can justify 200 patents? At different times they were filed, which means that they actually have more than 20 years, which is so-called minimum in law today. So we see so many things. Even when you take out your box of medicines, and there's the description in there of the side effects and the contraindications, etc., dosages. There's been an attempt to try and make that copyrighted, so that if you have a generic product, you cannot use that same information, because it will be infringement of the originator company. Now that is not happening yet because there's been a pushback. So then we can have a list of not just patents, but so many different aspects and know-how. Even if there's no patent barrier, that knowledge of how to make that is not shared because it's a trade secret. Trade secrets have no time limit, it's forever. And then some things, everybody can make it. It's not rocket science, but because there's a patent, you can do it. So all this just came out. So for us, how do we take the opportunity to make that technical, to sort of say, first of all, it's not just vaccines, it's about treatment medicines, therapeutics, diagnostics, my God, how expensive they can be, mask, PPEs, everything you can think of that you need, from the lab to the hospital to post-care, they are all tied up with intellectual property. How do we get that across to people? The vaccine was the one that had the public imagination, and hence it's a wedge for us in terms of really exposing the range of everything that we have in our lives. It's caught up in that monopoly. And secondly, we have to explain that, and it's not easy. We struggle. In Third World Network, we follow this so minutely because we need to be able to engage. But to translate that, and this is something that we actually work very well together, because our colleagues and friends in Dawn will say, okay, you can say all this, but how do you make it simple, 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 but without losing? Simplicity doesn't mean being simplistic, because these are not simple issues, but they're not so complicated that you cannot understand. If we as lawyers have to learn how to pronounce these, the names of the different medicines and vaccines, then the medical people have to learn a little bit more about intellectual property. We have to demystify. And I think demystification is a very important part of really showing that you use jargon in law a lot to be able to make things so difficult that you intimidate people. So we work, before even COVID, we work with health ministries. We work with so many other parts of government decision-making for the health system to just demystify. And one of the most important things that's happened with the waiver campaign, now there will be a lot of, we can discuss that later. People are saying, oh my God, it was a complete failure, etc., etc. But really, you think about it, we have had on the front page news of every one of our newspapers in every country, Main Street, from New York Times to our national papers. Waiver, patents, right? Take it away because we need it. So the narrative has just changed because people are now saying, hey, not all intellectual property is good. And suddenly they're talking about copyright and trade secrets and ventilators. So that awareness has grown. And for us, the challenge is to say, don't get intimidated, demystify, and get that, popularize the information and say, if this is wrong, we can change it. We can change it, all right? So, and this is what the fight at the WTO is about, because you have to be able to follow, to know which country, and this is, I think, the beauty of the campaign for all the, one of the things is that we could campaign and say which country was saying what, all the shenanigans, right? Even when they close the doors and take even countries out, don't talk about you and me and civil society, right? They were keeping official representatives of states and members of the WTO out of the most important discussions. But we could expose that, right? And we could name them and we could shame them and we could take it back to the national capitals. So it's linking the technical, the political, the social, economic parts of it, all within rights. The right to participate and have knowledge, the right to say my body has equal rights with the next. And some of us need even more protection because we are more vulnerable. And I think all those layers came out. And trying to unpack that, I think, is a challenge that we have. And the cartoons, Dawn got this wonderful hello from Brazil, and to put all that and to visualize it, to put it in graphics, in cartoons, to have satire at the same time to really get the message across. And I think this the multiplicity of the different forms of the information that this campaign is bringing together has been really exciting, and we have a long way to go. But and we have lots of lessons to learn. But it is really bringing it all together in a way that can demystify, debunk, and then to build really what our demands are. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think, I would just say one thing, you brought up the thing of books, Yoke Ling, that none of us can afford. Books, what journal articles? We can't read journal articles. Yes. Because you have to pay $45
for one article, yes.
For one article. Who has $45? Certainly not in low and middle income countries to spend on one article. But as we know, there's a full-scale guerrilla movement.
Yes.
Making, thanks to this brilliant young woman in Central Asia. And, that is the reality of how most students in LMICs get access to literature. They're not going to, and as long as they're, India, for instance, there's a huge pressure by Elsevier and all these guys, the usual corporate pressure. So to prevent this from happening, but the courts have been very sympathetic to students, scholars, and so on, saying, just forget it. You're not getting so far at any rate. But the point is, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it's a book, whether it's a medicine, whether it is what the product is. The question is, can I put a stamp of a patent or a trademark or on it, and then it becomes mine? And that's how you got the tobacco industry. What a marvelous thing, right? Big tobacco and big pharma coming together. So please smoke our product on the one side or chew it. And then, please buy our medicines on the other side. Just think of the irony of that coming together, which has happened during during that. It happened visibly during this pandemic. But we have a lot to do.
Yeah. Maybe just a quick question, then I think we should also let maybe other views come in from the group. But there's a quick question, I think from Rosie, about really what about the waiver. Maybe just to give a very quick snapshot. I think, as you would have been following, the original waiver that India and South Africa have put on the table, which, in the end, I think a lot of it was through the advocacy of the global campaign, including our partners in this one. So we did in the end get, 63 other countries, and this is unprecedented, to have 65 countries to actually put an official proposal in the WTO to say that we want, and it was temporary, yeah? But to just say, this is what I meant about debunking that you can't touch this intellectual property system, right? They wanted a temporary waiver, and waivers are actually provided for in the WTO system of different agreements. It recognizes that in very exceptional circumstances and situations, you will need to suspend, all these different obligations of countries, because, all the group of agreements in the WTO covers every aspect of our life. Services, goods, it's not just trade. So the word trade is very misleading. It covers, how you want to run your businesses, your manufacturing, your services, anything you can't drop physically is called a service. And that's actually governed, not 100%, but a lot. And they use words like disciplines on member states, what you can and cannot do, right? So the waiver is actually a legal kind of a tool you can use to just, to suspend different agreements, different parts of the agreements. So really the original idea was very straightforward. We have a pandemic, we have a shortage of everything, not just vaccines, right? The vaccines hadn't come out at that time. But so the idea was we waive for a certain period. It was left open because we don't know when this pandemic is going to actually, how it's going to play out. And you temporarily, there's a list of the sections of the TRIPS agreement that will be suspended. And you don't have to have any conditions on that, so that you can just allow the freedom of those with capacity to roll out production and trade and moving around to countries, because most countries don't have the capacity to make a lot of these products because they didn't have a chance to develop that because of all the restrictions. And others like India and Brazil or South Africa in the South have capacity, but could not export many of these things under some of these restrictions. So the idea of the waiver was just to take away all those conditions and restrictions and allow manufacturing and movement across borders to where people need it, okay? And then you would bring the price down, etc. So that was the idea, and it would cover all the different products and all the different types of intellectual property. What we had after 20 months of I think we went, Gita, right, almost like a year and a half, where the EU, the UK, just refused to budge. They didn't even want to look at that short, it wasn't more than 2 pages. The actual decision is very short, a few paragraphs, right, the proposal. They didn't even want to discuss the wording, because they said, and this is the EU kept saying this all the way to the end. Really, the problem here isn't intellectual property. We have no problem, So first of all, they denied that there was a problem, and then they just stalled and stalled and stalled. Now, when the Biden administration came in, and they say we will support a waiver of all the different types of intellectual property, but only on vaccines. Everybody was saying, oh my God, that's amazing, coming from the United States, right? But the pharma is the worst. But of course, now we realize that the worst is a competition between the Swiss and the UK and the Germans. And we can't understand why for Germany, given that the vaccine that came from Germany was publicly funded, as was the British one, right? So they are not Pfizer, they are not AstraZeneca, they were public ones. So they were so even the US kept very quiet. In the end, after the first hoo-ha, I love the way the US trade representative, Ms. Tai, she said at one point when she was being pressed by mostly civil society questioning, why is the United States so quiet after the first announcement? She said, oh, just because we are not, reportedly saying this, but we're doing our part behind the scene. Remember, she gave that analogy where she said, we are like the duck, you look so serene on the top of the water, but our feet are all paddling away, right? We're actually doing something. But surely there was a lot of paddling, but it wasn't moving anywhere, right? So what happened was, in the end, lots of lessons to be learned, but really what we had in the end, because of the sheer resistance And in the end, the whole ministerial was extended by 48 hours, day and night, okay? And we won't go into the details of, well, maybe it does matter because we highlighted, right, all the information that you were part. UAEM did fantastic advocacy on this, right? The green room, I think we all learned, everybody overnight learned about the WTO green room where, at the special invitation of the Director General of the WTO, the most vocal people we brought together to silence you. So you have all the northern, culprits are there in the room. Only a few of the vocal ones we brought in from the south, and then you actually use the green room, and it's always been that tradition in the WTO to silence anybody who tries to fight for something that is good, right? And they do that, and it was notorious, this green room. So they promised after a huge civil society campaign, even developing countries actually put their foot down at some point in the Seattle ministerial a few years ago. So they promised they will not do this green room thing. All right, it's called green room because back in the early days, the Director General of the WTO in Geneva, his room was painted green walls. That's why it was called the green room, because that was where it would happen. So, but in this ministerial, this green room exclusive on invitation only came back in full force. And there was a lot of that debate. Now, so what we had in the end was really a major compromise. So it is, now the decision is just called the TRIPS agreement decision. They don't use the word waiver. The South didn't want it to be called a waiver because this had so little bearing to the original waiver proposal. The North doesn't want to call it a waiver because they don't want to accept the fact that there can even be a waiver that could be accepted. So that's why they call it a decision. So it's a few paragraphs. So the only thing, just to give a summary, the only thing that is really waived, in other words, you actually suspend, is a very strict condition in the WTO TRIPS agreement that if you were to manufacture a generic version of a pharmaceutical product, and you did it without the consent, in other words, it's patented, and you didn't get the consent of the patent holder, so you can get a license to do it. We call a compulsory license without the consent of the patent holder. The government can, under the law, give you a license to manufacture. And there was a very strict rule that if you manufacture under a compulsory license in the country, most of it has to be used domestically. They limit what you can export. And that means that a country like India, which has a lot of capacity to manufacture, will have to use most of it. It's restricted in export. So in the end, after all the fights, that restriction has been waived. So now you can actually manufacture with a compulsory license if there is a patent barrier in India, for example, and export most, if not even all, of the products to another country that cannot manufacture for themselves. But it's only limited to vaccine. That's number one. Secondly, the real waiver is this condition on export when you manufacture under a compulsory license. The rest of it is restating really what is already in the WTO TRIPS agreement. You already have some room to maneuver. So that's really where it is. The EU totally did not want to include diagnostics and therapeutics, and the UK as well. And the US got quiet, but really was quite behind this whole thing. And Japan, basically all the OECD countries. So, but the developing countries, the South said that if we don't have this inclusion of therapeutics and diagnostics, we cannot accept this decision. So the compromise is to say within the next 6 months, taking it down, we will deal with this. It's going to be a hard fight. So it's not there, but it's there, right? Now, whether it will become real, so will we see a repeat of what happened in the last 20 months over vaccines? Yes. If they don't want it, they made it very clear, pharma will not allow, pharma is not happy with this little bit of whatever is left from our perspective, right? So nobody is happy. So what do we do? So this decision, in a summary, is really just that. And then, of course, there was this big thing with China and the US, which has nothing to do with the needs of COVID. The US just didn't want China to be able to use a waiver, and therefore they wanted China to be excluded without naming China. So you have this thing called the footnote number 1 that is very convoluted. So if you didn't know, you wonder what they're talking about. But it basically means that China has agreed that it will not use the waiver. This decision. Okay, so if China can, for example, make these vaccines and make them very cheaply, they are not allowed to export to other countries if there's a patent involved. Okay, that's what it really, which is really crazy, because the countries that actually have capacity to manufacture should really be free to do so. So there will be these constraints, right? So that's really where the decision is. What can we do now? What has remained very clear is that we have existing freedom to operate yes, with certain constraints, yes, but we have it already in the TRIPS agreement. We have not used it enough in the past. And we can use it not just for vaccines or COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnosis. We can use it for cancer. We can use it for anything, right? And this is the thing that is very important for us all to also be aware of, because in the past, the North was very adamant against using this thing called compulsory license. Every time you try to use it, even though it's perfectly legal internationally and in your law, there's so much pressure from pharma. They threaten not to bring new products to your country, you know, and then the government, like the US government, come and step in, the ambassador come and see your prime minister. And because this, the Europeans and all that hate the waiver, so in the course of the last 20 months, they said, you don't need a waiver. If you really need to do something, use a compulsory license. Right? So we say, okay, I think that's a very good advice. We will use it. Just do not come and bully us when we try to use it. So moving forward, we need to do a lot of work at the national level. We need to bring this information and really the opportunities legally and politically exist. Legally exist, whether politically it's going to happen or not, I think it's up to all of us. So I just want to point that out, you know, and you're interested, we will be writing out more of these sort of articles. And I think the first statement that came out from Feminists for People's Vaccine actually did a highlight of the shortcomings of the final decision that was adopted. And also remember that the pressure was intense on the different governments because, first of all, nobody really saw the final thing. And then most people were exhausted. They just adopted it without even having that piece of paper in their hand. And that was also part of a package of other agreements, which all of them were controversial in different ways. Yeah. And so this package of take it or leave it is a very common tactic to force people to sort of like, you know, it was more about saying we cannot leave Geneva with nothing. So there was a lot of interest of the DG who just became the DG. This is a first ministerial conference, and it's not a secret. She actually really bullied the African group and the least developed countries to just stay silent. So we need to actually do a lot of work to really get our countries to say, you cannot accept. This is not the way international decision-making takes place because lives are at stake. So we have a lot to do. And we will also go back to the fundamentals because there are many things in the TRIPS agreement that we have not used enough of in the past. So let's find ways of actually running the campaign in the next few months. At the same time, to take whatever that is in the waiver and push the envelope, right? If we bring diagnostics and, you know, but understanding that it doesn't mean that at the end of 6 months or another 20 months, you will not get what you want, but we should not allow all decisions to be made only in that one place because we can do a lot of things at the national level.
Yes.
So let me step in to just add a couple of things to what Yoke Ling just said. One is, I think that it's important to realize, particularly for this audience, how bad the EU was. The EU was absolutely horrible, absolutely horrible. As long as they could prevent it even being looked at, they did. When they finally agreed to start talking, it was in the context of the so-called Quad, which was the EU, the US, India, and South Africa, just talking for months, February, March, April, to each other to try and see if they could work out something. And we suspect that when the Quad, in the run up to the ministerial, when the negotiations were going on, the UK, because it was not part of the Quad, came in and acted very peevish and said, we don't like this, we don't like that of what you've agreed to, and here's what we want to add, much of which would have made whatever was there up to that point much worse. And the EU said, you know, went along with that and said, actually, that's right. The UK is making a very good point. And so we agree with the UK. even though the EU had been part of the Quad. Now, we suspect that this was your classic pre-planned good cop, bad cop routine. Or as I said, yes, in yesterday partners gathering, it was bad cop and worse cop routine, fully planned between them, so that even what they had agreed to, which was not good at all in the Quad, would get further weakened by the UK, and then the EU would jump in and agree with the UK to make it even worse. So the role of the European Union in Big Pharma, in the support of Big Pharma, has been critical. And I think that's where the role that groups like yours can play as UAEM from Europe is really, really, really important. Because it's one thing for us to, sort of, bring out what is happening, who's affected, how they're affected, what the inequalities and the inequity, injustices of what's going on. It's another thing for you guys as European citizens. I mean, we had actually hoped that Germany, after your elections and the change of government, getting the Social Democrats and the Green Party, and the Green Party leader had said before the elections that she was in support of a waiver. And all of that vanished completely after they came into power. We cannot hold them to account, but it's the European groups that need to step in to hold the European Union. We can do it on the basis of the larger global citizenry, but you're the ones who have the possibility of really doing it and mounting advocacy that can actually move in that direction. So I just wanted to add that to what Chee Yoke Ling just said.
I think that's a very fair point, and we were all very disappointed to see how our governments acted during the negotiations without listening to the public opinion, really, and being highly influenced by pharma and the industry. I'm actually really glad you brought up the TRIPS negotiations, because I think that has been sort of the elephant in the room for quite a while in the access to medicines world. We have all been working on it for a long time. And I would like to ask a few more questions about how we want to proceed in the future with our campaigns. But before that, I think we have a few questions coming in from the audience. I think Lydia was first. Lydia, could you maybe take the floor and ask the question yourself?
Yes, of course. So thank you, everyone. I think I had a question about, so Yoke Ling, you mentioned that there is a lot to be done on a national level and not just on an international level. And I was just trying to take the conversation there and ask a question about what there is, if there's anything that public health organizations, students and public health professionals can do, concrete things they can do to change the public perception that innovation relies on intellectual property rights, and that the TRIPS waiver may not necessarily be a good idea. Because even myself, I do a public health degree, and there's many of my co-students and even professors, they share the view that the TRIPS waiver isn't necessarily a good thing, and there's a lot of skepticism, and a lot of people have the profound conviction that that intellectual property rights are necessary for innovation. Is there anything that any arguments that we could make on a more level?
I think really there is really a lot of literature to show that there is no direct correlation between so-called higher and higher standards of intellectual property. When they mean higher standards, they mean more and more exclusivity and monopoly kind of rules that are even worse than what we have in TRIPS, right? TRIPS, at least, like I said, left considerable space if you know how to translate that to your national law to use it. But pharma that actually wrote, it was the pharmaceutical industry, the biotechnology industry, and the agribusiness who came together to actually produce the draft that became TRIPS. They went and they lobbied because it came in really, a little bit later into that round of negotiations. So they went to the EU, they went to Japan, they went to the United States, and they lobbied them to introduce this into this trade world, right, into the world of trade. So, and they were not satisfied with they didn't get everything they wanted. And that's why they've gone into all these other free trade agreements, from NAFTA for the North Americans to, to Pacific, Trans-Pacific agreements and all the bilateral agreements that the US signed with Central America and all the countries around the world, was to have an intellectual property chapter. That's what we commonly, as you are familiar with, called TRIPS Plus, right? So the monopolistic things that they got into TRIPS was not enough for them. So they keep wanting to push for more and more. They really just want totally monopoly, right? And using the law to do that. So at the same time, and a lot of it is very structured lobbying, in terms of, and they do a lot of technical training of patent officers and ministries. So it's a very concerted effort to sell that mindset, right? At the same time, there's a lot of literature that shows that these higher standards of intellectual property do not translate into more investments, foreign investments, neither does it translate to more innovation. And interestingly enough, a lot of the really good reports come from the Federal Trade Commission of the United States that really shows the number of actual new molecules that, so, we always use the word discover. It's always a discovery, because a lot of these things are not invented. It is really through and more there's interest in biological products. Why? Because the real new chemical molecules, for every dollar you put into so-called R&D, you are not getting that many. So that kind of data exists. So there's a lot of now switching back to ethnobotany and all that kind of thing, indigenous peoples, local communities, how to be using to be able to get shortcuts. So biological drugs are really now the big thing. You are all medical students, many of you are studying in this area. You know that for cancer, for even many of the vaccines we're talking about, and many of the biotherapeutics, they're actually biological drugs, right? So the case for, first of all, treating that as a new invention that's so novel that it didn't exist before, and therefore you give it monopolies, that can be attacked. So we need to work around, even if you are stuck with having to recognize patents in this field, you have to be so strict as to what really is new and is novel and involves an inventive step. Set high standards there. That's why countries like Egypt, for example, have a very interesting patent examination standards, right? So a lot of things that will be patented in many countries, you won't find them patented. For example, pharmaceuticals in Egypt. India used to be like that, but India is under a lot of pressure to change its norms. So it's not that. So I think that's one part of work. The other one is to really use the information on what innovation really means. I think we need to popularize. I think we need to really bring this out, because this idea that innovation only comes with giving intellectual property rewards is actually it's a mantra. You repeat often enough, people believe it, but there is no evidence to support it. So there's a lot of literature. Let's get that literature and let's think about how to popularize it into really advocacy. Now, I want to just raise the model that, I don't like to use the word alternative model, because for me, this monopolistic assumption that intellectual property is the basis for innovation, that is the alternative to really collaborative public research. And even private research, collaborative research. So if you look at the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDI, they were set up really by a group of people from MSF, because when they got the Nobel Peace Prize, they took part of the prize money and they used it as seed money to set up DNDI that looked at what was supposed to be originally neglected diseases. Diseases of the poor, where it's no profit for the pharma industry. So they have actually gone and worked with pharma companies, but develop drugs, bring it to the market, like a river blindness, sleeping sickness, Chagas, disease. And so there are a number of drugs that have been produced that nobody was interested in. But so the DNDI model is very interesting. For hepatitis C, hepatitis C is not a neglected disease in that sense of, it was not a disease only of the poor and neglected. But it was a case where there was a cure called sofosbuvir as a backbone drug, but it was so expensive, nobody could actually include it into the national systems, including NHS in the UK, right? Or the Dutch government. So DNDi then went and found a molecule that was neglected. So it's a neglected molecule. And say, here, you have a lot of people getting hepatitis C, but you had a cure, but you couldn't get it. And so they worked on another drug. And they did a combination with Malaysian, Thai ministries of health, etc. And they did clinical trials. And Malaysia became the first country to register this new drug called Ravidasvir for hepatitis C. And that was to show that you can have innovation done in a different way, and it is an open license, right? So there are these, first of all, collaborative models, but they don't have a chance because they don't get investment. So I think this is a whole area where the literature is there to debunk that IP equals innovation equals, more new drugs. And I think that has not been part of the advocacy work before. I think we need to really work on that. And if it's publicly funded, we can put conditions. Why should publicly funded, medicines be allowed to be turned into a monopoly? Now, the whole model came from the US, from this law called the Bayh-Dole Law, where first you cut public funding in universities and research, and then you force the universities in every field to go and get money with public partnership. And then you force the universities to only do research that can be, to end up with things that are patentable. Then it's a vicious cycle. And that, even in the US, there is a lot of uneasiness and even some kind of hearings going on about these kind of things. So I think that the moment is here for us to think about how we can take on the innovation argument, because it's not from lack of information, it's just that it's not become an advocacy point. And it's something I think we can do. And already because of the COVID experience, there is a lot of talk about how governments, and it's, I think many of the groups are really calling for that. Put a condition, if it's publicly funded, then A, B, C, D, E, right? So I think that would be important. Now, Els, I think, has a quick comment about, why did, that's another, I think, webinar, why India and South Africa. I don't think they were actively involved. This Quad, in the end, they brought these four, vocal voices, EU, US, South Africa, and India, to us the last months. But what we found out subsequently is that it wasn't as if member states were talking to each other, even in that Quad, all right? It was really the WTO DG coming in and kind of, steering things and pushing and coming up with her draft. And, remember that leaked text? It was supposed to be the court text, but actually it was the DG of the WTO and her team in the secretariat who drafted that. Now, there are many reasons why, and it has to do with domestic politics as well as, whatever. But I think part of what we did in all the campaigns around this issue of the waiver was to put pressure at the national level, calling out. Right now, even now, why are they celebrating? Because every minister wants to celebrate because they don't want to say. It takes a very brave minister to say, I would rather not sign, because there's a lot of pressure. Do you want to be responsible for the collapse of the entire MC12? And what we are feeling angry about in terms of the process, it wasn't just for the waiver. It's like that for fisheries, for the agriculture issue, for the e-commerce issue. It is the systemic problem of the WTO decision-making. Member states actually are not at the driving seat. And I think we need to call that out. So that these are some of the things that we can systematically go through in terms of, and how strong a government is in the negotiation room in Geneva depends on how much strength they have at the national level to be able to sustain a position. And that's where the national work, I think, partly also is required, that we hold accountability at all levels. We cannot leave it to even a few good people in Geneva, because when the politics and the political pressure comes, they call up your president and prime minister, and they can actually change their minds. Now, in this case, the prime minister of India and the president of South Africa took on the issue in a very big way themselves. But, there are so many factors. But I don't think I don't think that we appear as sort of like radicals, because I think in every country where ministers are, it's only the Indian prime minister, maybe some people, I don't think, not prime minister, the Indian commerce minister, I don't think other ministers, other government people are celebrating this. In fact, they are very frustrated and angry.
Well,
Yeah.
Ramaphosa made that statement.
He did. He was celebrating whatever, and then
Fatima
Farida
Hassan came
Fatima
up. Yep.
Hassan came up, and I think the media is giving. See, the media reporting is also very interesting, right? Because now they just don't reproduce what the president says. Fatima Hassan, who is one of the leading voices in South Africa, access movement, who's also part of our campaign, she spoke up and she had half a page in that report, So I think we need to do that. So we have to think among ourselves, and this applies to UM, as Gita was saying earlier on. Do we say, oh, this waiver is terrible, the whole system, let's just close down WTO? We've been calling, well, not we, but calling for WTO to be closed down for a long time. It just doesn't close down like that, right? You have to undermine, call it out, and there are many things to do. And I think your approach in UAEM, in terms of how you do, Gita and I and others were talking, how do we have an inside outside? How do we go in there so we know what's happening inside? So we know the technicalities. At the same time, we can translate that into a political force from the outside, but based on information, knowing what's going on, exposing. See, all this leak text came up because people in there just feel this is so horrible, we got to get it out there. We always get leak text. Different people on all kinds of issues, right? So let's build up and really learn the inside outside, because we need a new lease on the inside outside strategy, and a lot of it has to do with to take the technical as necessary, information to work with, and not to be intimidated by it.
But also to be able to take the strategies that we develop and then push them in where governments are speaking. Nothing is straightforward, but in this, it's complicated, it's difficult, but hey, this is not an easy world at this point. And honestly, although in the end, all that we got was a waiver of one piece of the existing compulsory license, one tiny thing, but we certainly got huge publicity. The issue is right there. And I think we need strong strategies to think about how we bring this information out. For instance, something, and I know Els and I have talked about this many times in the past. I think Els is left. No, Els is there, which is the fact that pharma will not tell you what their costs are. If they're spending so much, show us your costs. Tell us what you're spending it on. So everything, all the work that's been done to sort of piece together shows that like hell they're spending.
Yeah.
Even what they say they're spending, it's not being spent on innovation, on R&D. It's being spent on marketing and things, things related to selling the product, not really to discovering the molecule or even testing. So much talk about, how much they're spending on clinical trials. Oh, really? This is, corporations have really learned in every field to get freebies from the public and then claim that it's their costs. So tell me, Elsevier produces, going back to our journal articles, produces and makes you pay $45 for a journal article. So what exactly is it that Elsevier did? The article is written by a researcher for no payment. The article is reviewed by peer researchers for no payment. The decision about whether it will be published or not is taken by experts for no payment. So what is it that else the publishing company has put into this? Which part of the production of the article were they involved in? None of it. They aggregate it and sell it. It's marketing that they're doing. And that's the same thing, by and large, that's happening in drugs. Clinical trials, you get paid. How would they get the ability to run clinical trials if there were not hundreds of thousands of people volunteer guinea pigs for them to experiment on? They don't pay for that.
No.
So it's completely a smoke and mirrors game. And that, in answer, I think, to Rosie's question and maybe Lydia's earlier, that is the one that really needs to be understood. They've done a great job of making it appear that innovation is the reason for IP, intellectual property. And nothing could be further from the truth.
I think they see what is interesting is that it is being challenged. For example, for a long time, there was an old study done by Tufts University, and that has always been quoted as how many billions it takes to actually have a drug brought to market. I've been talking to some people in the industry itself. It's very interesting. These are big pharma, people who are in the medical side and all that, and they say that the actual cost of the R&D to bring a drug to the market is one of the biggest secrets in a company. So only very few people have access to the actual disaggregated data. And so if you look at hepatitis C, all those direct acting antivirals, Andrew Hill and his team in the UK actually got enough information from generic producers and API, etc. And they costed what it would, even with a reasonable profit margin, the cost would be nowhere near $84,000 for 12 weeks of treatment, as in the US, right? So I think there is information like that, but it hasn't really gone out enough to be a part of advocacy. And I think that's an area, that's why these questions are really, really very pointed to where we could actually look at where we need to do more advocacy. And the other thing, of course, is the R&D cost. There is no surprise transparency in terms of the how much they actually spend. Just before the pandemic, ironically, it was under the Trump administration, because the highest cost of medicines and medical products is actually the United States, because they go where they think they can really squeeze the most you can for your profits, right? Remember, there was a Senate committee or Congress committee hearing where all the top CEOs of the big pharma from Europe as well, the US, because they were operating in the US, they were hauled up and they were asked very tough questions on precisely these issues, right? And it's in a way that somehow kind of disappeared from the radar screen because of the pandemic. But even in the United States, which is really where, frankly, a lot of this whole model is actually, that's the birthplace. So we have to really get our advocacy in the North is absolutely crucial, because and I think the COVID-19 has given us that crack, of that system to work with. And so really, I think for UAEM, the work in Europe and the work in the United States, very, very crucial. Because this R&D claim really is smoking screen, and is a myth. And there is enough information on particular drugs. And the model now for these big companies is they buy up other companies. The business model is to buy up other smaller biotech companies. Real innovation is coming from smaller biotech companies. And there are cases written up and documented that they're going out there and they're just sort of scrounging for these companies. And that's the model. Which means that, and those smaller companies are the ones that actually get a lot of public support as well, even in the United States, right? So I think that business model is also well documented. Now, I think that's an area we can expand for our advocacy work.
Absolutely, yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I think we have already done some work in clinical trial transparency, and we will keep doing it. It is quite difficult, as you already said, but we will keep pushing. I think because of the time, we need to wrap up. So I want to thank both of you again, Gita Sen and Yoke Ling, for sharing your expertise with us. I think we all learned a lot. And I know I'll be closely following the Feminists for a People's Vaccine movement, and as well as Dawn and TWN. I also want to thank Kathy and Lydia and the FemMed team for organizing this series. It was really interesting, and hopefully it has inspired all of us to explore the intersection of gender and health a bit more, and continue to learn more on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you all, and it's great to have you as a partner in the in the FPV campaign.
We'll be working on all this together, right? So don't worry.
Yep.
You know, we'll do it together. We'll get your ideas too on how to make this campaign work deeper, broader, better.
Yep, indeed.
Absolutely.
Good to see you, Els.
Thank you so much for your time, and it was a very interesting discussion, and would be great to stay in touch. If there's anything UAEM can do, or like as an alliance member as well, let us know.
Yep, we will. We'll be in touch. Stay in touch.
We will. We're already making a list. It's growing longer for what we'd like to work with you on, right, Gita?
Yep, indeed. Els, you've got to join us. I don't know where you are or what you're doing these days. We need you.
Okay. Well, thank you and all the best.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a great night.